Welcome back to Moonlight Lore, everyone. As always, I'm your host, Jordan Hopkins. Last episode, we discussed the story of the mysterious lost lemon mine, a gold mine so valuable it has been estimated to be worth millions, if not billions of dollars. Nowadays, there are only a handful of people who truly know the story behind the mine after only hearing about it by those who have ties to the area. And as it is a lengthy and difficult thread to follow at some points, many people have questioned if it's true or not. Hundreds of people have gone out searching for the mine and have come up empty-handed. Skeptics believe the mine was all just a fabrication and wasn't anything more than just the ramblings of a madman. So with the knowledge of the events of what happened in the last episode, let's get back into the story of the lost lemon mine. So where we left off, John McDougall, a Métis mountain man, perished by the hands of a drink called rock gut and was buried outside the whiskey fort of Fort Kipp. McDougall at the time had been on his way to meet a priest and a few other men waiting for him up at Crow's Nest Lake in Alberta, who hoped he would be able to show them the way to the grave of Blackjack, one of the men who had discovered the lemon gold mine. The other discoverer, Lemon, had fallen into a crazed madness the previous year and was no longer able to recover the memory of the mine's location after an unsuccessful attempt of returning to the mine earlier that year. So with the only three men who would have an idea of the mine's location now either dead or crazy, the priests and prospectors waiting at Crow's Nest Lake briefly attempted to search for it, only to come up defeated and drained after a short few weeks. The priest knew Blackjack's body was buried out there somewhere, and knowing McDougall had piled large rocks over the grave as a small memorial and to keep animals from digging up the corpse, he mainly searched for this sign. But as it turned out, he wasn't able to recover the location of the gravesite for a very particular reason. It no longer existed. If we jump back in the story a bit, back to when Lemon had just murdered the sleeping Blackjack by the fire, there comes a point when Lemon, stewing in guilt, began to hear the howling of what sounded like spirits among the trees. This was the point that the madness that was in Lemon's mind already began to tighten its grip. But if we look past the brush, just beyond the light of Lemon's campfire, we find two shadowy figures, two brothers, William and Daniel Bendow, two members of the Stoney Nakoda tribe, also referred to as Stoney Braves in many of the stories, had been following Lemon and Blackjack as the two had been traveling through their territory. They had trailed the prospectors for days, stealthily staying hidden, and eventually came to be the only witnesses to the argument between Lemon and Blackjack, and then the eventual death of Blackjack by the hands of Lemon. Now, perhaps it was a way of punishing Lemon, or it was a touch of dark humor by the two Stonies, but once they saw the panic on Lemon's face after he had just killed Blackjack, they couldn't resist the opportunity to mess with him. They were the ones who produced the ghostly moans Lemon would hear coming from the dark trees that night, tricking him into thinking Blackjack's spirit was coming to torment him. It wasn't until Lemon retreated down the mountain did the two brothers ransack the prospectors' camp, taking the remaining horses and useful items back to their camp and reporting the murder to their leader, Chief Bearspaw. Chief Bearspaw, now knowing two prospectors had been digging in the area and having found gold, then had William and Daniel swear to secrecy in an attempt to keep the news of prospectors and gold in the area as quiet as possible to avoid an influx of white men coming into their territory. And knowing others might come back to the area to retrieve or bury the body, he had William and Daniel, plus a couple others to keep a watchful eye on the site. And as we know, John McDougall did in fact come up to the site of the murder to bury the body, and once he had finished and left the scene, Chief Bearspaw gave the order to destroy the small grave monument and to scatter the stones McDougall used to completely hide the location from anyone searching for the gravesite, causing the resting place of Blackjack, and quite possibly the area where the gold rests, to be completely swallowed up by the wilderness, forever disappearing. As we very obviously know, the secret of the lost lemon mine wasn't hidden for long. It was only 6 months after the death of Blackjack would Lemon and a new crew head out to search for the gold and fail. Then a year after that, the priest and his team attempted the same feat, but again failed. But finally, after 2.5 years from Blackjack's murder, another team of prospectors headed out into the hills and mountains near Crow's Nest Pass to conduct their own search. They had left Tobacco Plains and made it all the way to Crow's Nest Lake, the same place the priest and his crew had been waiting for MacDougal. But upon reaching the lake, this new band of prospectors were forced to turn back after a large wildfire swept through the area, completely destroying and burning up the trees, causing many important landmarks to literally go up in flames, along with the grass on the ground needed to feed the prospectors' horses. With these major setbacks, attempting to search or recover the gold would be impossible. This timeline now leads us to 3.5 years after the death of Blackjack, and now this next party would be led by two familiar people, the priest and the still crazed and mad Lemon, followed by a handful of other prospectors. In an attempt to travel through the mountains under the leadership of Lemon's failing memory, the party of men eventually came near to where Lemon had killed his old friend. Upon realizing where he was, Lemon reportedly became violently unstable, which forced the party to return and escort Lemon back to Tobacco Plains and give up their search entirely. And it was with this final mental break did Lemon relieve himself from the story. Unable to regain his senses after this, Lemon fled down to Texas to live out the remainder of his days under the care of his brother, never to return to Alberta, and never to set eyes on the gold responsible for his downward spiral into madness. With these turn of events, and realizing he would probably never find the mine on his own, the priest too gave up his search, and continued to settle for a life in the church. But this was certainly not the last party who outfitted a search for the lost gold. A man named Nelson, who had taken part in Lemon's search in the spring after the death of Blackjack, put together his own group of prospectors in pursuit of the gold, but were met with disappointment and empty pockets, causing the group to go their separate ways. This would then lead each of them to set off into the mountains on their own to try and find the gold by themselves, only teaming up with 1 or 2 other people also exploring the area. Of course though, all of them again walked away empty-handed. Now if you remember from the last episode, I explained how Lemon and Blackjack first ended up in the area in the North Saskatchewan River and headed down to Tobacco Plains where they went on to discover the gold. The man who originally hired the two on this trip, Lafayette French, an outfitter and trader, also made a trip to Tobacco Plains to begin his own quest on finding the hidden cache. French would then go on to spend much of his time obsessing over Lemon's lost gold, and he claimed to be armed with something many people would have killed over, a map drawn by Lemon himself. As the crudely drawn map showed, without much more than a few landmarks, a few mountains, and streams. One of the streams, though, which forked into 3 parts, had a large X written on it, with the capitalized letters spelling out the word gold. This was more than enough to motivate anyone to delve into those mountains and search for its location. But upon his return a couple weeks later, Lafayette, with empty pockets, reportedly looked as if he was closer to death than alive, with a strange illness ailing him. Now, as one could imagine, living out in the wild, scouring the Rocky Mountains in the late 1800s was no easy feat. Adding the desperate mind of those searching for the very thing that will make them the richest person in the country, only to walk away empty-handed after weeks of searching for it, must have taken its toll on more than a few people. But even though Lafayette was in rough shape, understandably due to the elements and circumstances, rumors began to spread about a curse surrounding the lost gold, faltering some who had been interested in searching for it, but also encouraging others to be the ones to conquer the curse and bring home the treasure. The strange sickness, however, didn't deter Lafayette's motivation and determination, and he would go on to spend the better part of 3 more decades in the mountains, scouring for any sign of Lemon's lost gold, and he would go on to spend quite a bit of his own money in hopes of retracing the path Lemon and Blackjack took. In the winter of 1883, he would go on to supply the Métis band, led by Lanouse, who escorted Lemon and Blackjack from the North Saskatchewan River down to near Crow's Nest Pass. He hoped Lanouse would be able to give him some guidance later that coming spring on where Lemon and Blackjack had departed from the company of natives 13 years prior, in exchange for food, clothing, and other essentials. Then, in 1890, Lafayette would go on to hire the few surviving prospectors who had accompanied Lemon on his trip back to try and recover his gold. And though this resulted in a few landmarks being found, neither of these investments turned out profitable for Lafayette. But he had one more trick up his sleeve. You see, word had gotten out that two Stoney Nakotas had witnessed the murder of Blackjack and knew the location of the site. Upon hearing this, Lafayette's ears perked up and headed to Pincher Creek to strike up a deal. After supplying the Stoneys with food for the winter and gaining their trust, he struck up a deal with the band of natives. Lafayette would go on to secure ownership of 25 horses and 25 heads of cattle in a nearby pasture, and promised all of them to the band if William Bendow would lead him to the site of the murder. However, this was destined to fail as well. Halfway through the second day of their expedition, William called it off after remembering his promise to Chief Bearspaw and the repercussions of discovering a large sum of gold would bring to his tribe if it was found. Understandably, Lafayette was more than a little peeved at this and tried his best to convince William to follow through, but the Stoney wouldn't take another step. It wouldn't be until the end of Lafayette's quest would he attempt to search one last time, and 2 decades later, he returned to William Bendow at the Stoney camp and practically begged him for help. Perhaps it was out of sympathy for a desperate man who had given up so much of his life and money to this cause, but William finally agreed to lead him to the murder site. Lafayette would bring along George Emerson, a friend of his, and the 3 men set off once more into the forested mountains. Again though, fate would not allow Lafayette to reach his destination. A few days in the middle of their trip, William Bendow, their guide, passed away suddenly in his sleep, leaving a desperate Lafayette and George all alone. Upon returning to the tribe with the body of William, the members were understandably upset, but were convinced the sudden death was caused because William had gone back on his word and was betraying the very thing he swore secrecy to. This worry was solidified when the Stoneys packed up their supplies and headed to their reservation at Morley up near Calgary. Their arrival was met with more death, as on the night of their arrival at the reservation, William's son-in-law also passed away under mysterious circumstances, causing the rest of the tribe to stay tight-lipped about the secret of the lost lemon mine, in fear that they too would succumb to their untimely death. And as for Lafayette, he remained near Crow's Nest Pass continuing his search, using his friend's house as a form of home base. Although, it wasn't just William who was accosted from the curse. The night after returning William's body to the Stoneys, a mysterious fire swept through the George Emerson's house, brutally burning Lafayette, but leaving all else untouched. He wrote a quick note to a friend, telling him he was hot on the trail of where the mine was located, and he would be heading up to High River to collect some friends for an expedition and to share the information he had about its location. Unfortunately, due to the extent of his injuries from the fire, Lafayette passed away on Christmas Day, 1912, before ever making the trip to High River, and before he could ever pass on the valuable information regarding the location of the mine to anyone else. Now, as one might think, this story is quite the fabulous tale. It seems to have a little bit of everything thrown into it. But as is the case with any good legend, there are different variations of the story, causing many to question which one might be the more authentic version, and what was exaggerated or lied about. Many people had heard stories that Lemon had actually purchased the large gold nugget from a local native man, and created the tale of finding the nugget with Blackjack just to stir up attention and cause other prospectors to foot the bill for more outfits Lemon would then eventually try to lead unsuccessfully. As for the actual truth, we simply will never have an idea. In the years Lemon spent in the area, he retold many different versions of his story. Then the ones who heard the story would go on to either exaggerate or add their own facts to it, causing the original to more than likely become incredibly distorted. Over the course of the years since the alleged discovery, there have been several mini gold rushes in the province, some taking place up near the town of Nanton, others up near High River. But what most seem to agree on is most likely it's located near the Crow's Nest Pass. Going along Racehorse Creek and over the Racehorse Pass is an old First Nations pack trail which would leave those walking it through the mountains and into British Columbia. This trail is believed to be the same one Lemon had walked on long ago with Blackjack, as well as other prospectors of the time, Bill Olin and John Nelson, who both made note of the path's existence and their frequent trips on it. Based on what Bill Olin had mentioned, shortly after the establishment of the Northwest Mounted Police in Fort MacLeod, and after Lemon had already found the lost mine, the mounted police would often see Lemon along the trails and creeks attempting placer mining. So while it is confirmed Lemon was seen along the trails and streams, the police had no idea where exactly Lemon found all his gold, despite hearing the bragging from Lemon that he had found the motherlode. Now, as one would correctly wonder why, if he had managed to find such a large deposit or vein of gold, why would he be in the streams and creeks panning for more? Well, if we remember from the tale, after finding the mine, Lemon hadn't managed to find it again. So perhaps this was Lemon's attempt in narrowing down the vein himself by looking for any flakes that had flowed downstream. Like I said though, there are a few threads and stories about the life of Lemon that aren't quite consistent. What I shared before on how after going crazy, Lemon returned to America to live with his brother down in Texas for the remainder of his days. According to John Nelson, a prospector and buffalo hunter, Lemon's final moments were actually spent here in Alberta. According to Nelson, he ran into a lone native man who approached him with the intention of trading his gold for the rum Nelson had on him. As was the case with many white men at the time, to put it lightly, John Nelson had a distrust towards the First Nations people at the time. As if on instinct, when Nelson saw the native man pull out his gold, Nelson drew his gun and demanded he told him where he had acquired it. The native man told him he had murdered a lone prospector up in the mountains and stole his valuables. Considering the size of the gold nugget the native man had on him, Nelson thought this could very well have passed through the hands of Lemon, and if he could figure out where the body of the man the native had killed was, he would be able to narrow down the search greatly. Nelson gathered a few prospecting buddies, including Bill Olin, and traveled the path described to them by the native man, and came across an old, run-down cabin in the woods. When the group of men entered, they found the body of Lemon, sprawled out on the floor, decomposing. From their best guess, he had died the year before, and made the note that because the ground was still frozen from the winter, the men had taken Lemon's body and buried him inside a nearby cave to give the man a proper burial. Searching around the abandoned cabin proved pointless, as no clues where the rest of the gold was obvious, and all the group were able to find was a hastily written note next to where the body of Lemon had been found. This note, written by Lemon's hand, actually accused his partner Blackjack betraying him instead of the other way around in the other story. Apparently, Blackjack had stabbed Lemon after either an argument or out of greed, and fleeing with Lemon's share of the gold, leaving Lemon injured and bleeding in the cabin, which in turn would then mean that Blackjack was murdered by the native man a few months later, and having his precious gold then stolen from him, which would then come into the hands of Nelson. Written in the note, it was said Lemon had cursed his partner and the gold he stole, and wrote that he was more than likely heading down to Fort Benton, and whoever found the note, he would hope would bring Blackjack to justice. With news of Lemon's body and cabin being found somewhere near Racehorse Creek, this caused another mini gold rush to occur, bringing many desperate prospectors who would never see a speck of the gold dust they needed. During the time, the story of the lost lemon mine had become so well known, it almost wasn't worth mentioning in the papers. Most of the time, if a newspaper did run an article regarding the mine, it was usually just to talk about another search taking place by a group of people. But considering news clippings of the time and area are rare, and specific clippings discussing the mine itself was even more so, We don't really know a whole lot of information of how the public felt and received the news of the mine's existence. Though, to my best guess, it only seemed like prospectors, miners, and treasure hunters were the only ones interested in the articles. One account taken from the Helena Daily Rocky Mountain Gazette way back in August of 1870 goes into the story of a group of men, led by Lemon, had gone out into the mountains and actually discovering the 2 sunken pits dug by Lemon and Blackjack years before. But, for whatever reason, they were not able to recover even a sliver of the gold. This could have been caused by a great fire that had gotten out of control in the men's camp, causing all the men, including their horses, to retreat into the safety of the wet swamp nearby. Apparently, because of the fire, all their gear, tents, and food, and other essentials were completely burnt up, including the wooden handles of their shovels and picks, thus rendering the party of prospectors completely incapable of even attempting to uncover their find and forcing them to return home. 16 years later, in 1886, another surviving clipping of the time regarding the lemon gold emerged from the Calgary Daily Herald in October, talking about another party of prospectors heading out in search for the mine and claiming to give the correct account of what happened. I want to keep this short, as many of the points made in the news article are very similar to the points I've already mentioned in the original story, but there were some differences between the ones I shared in the last episode and the ones the newspaper reported. The first big one was, instead of the name of Blackjack, Lemon's partner was given the name Old George. Second, Lemon and Old George didn't travel down south with a band of Métis and Lanús. Instead, they traveled with their original company of prospectors they traveled up north with from Montana, but then broke off from them upon reaching near Crow's Nest Pass. Thirdly, after discovering the gold in Crow's Nest, instead of heading to Tobacco Plains, Lemon headed down south back to Montana to recruit more men to help excavate his find. These are the 3 main points of interest in the news story that directly conflict with the other main story. They serve to prove the Lost Lemon Mine may indeed stay lost due to so many versions of the story contradicting each other and leading treasure hunters throughout the years completely astray. And it's here I think I'll end with this part 2 episode for this topic, meaning I'll be coming back at you guys next week with another part to this mystery, mainly talking about the perspective and stories coming from the native population in the area. So hopefully you all find this story as interesting as I do, because there could also be a part 4 coming after that one. But if you are enjoying it, please remember to leave a 5-star review on iTunes and share the show with your friends and family so others who are interested in topics like the one I discuss here on the podcast can find the show and have a listen for themselves. You can also follow me on Instagram, where I post photos about some of the topics I talk about on the show, and my handle on that is Moonlight Lore Podcast. If you wanted to send me a message, feel free to message me there or on Twitter at LoreMoonlight or by email at moonlightlorepodcast@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you, and if you have any suggestions or ideas for topics you would like to hear on the podcast, or have a cryptic or paranormal encounter happen to you, or if you simply just want to say hi, please do so. But until next time, keep your lanterns lit and keep exploring the unknown.